All right, good morning, everybody. Great couple sessions thus far. I'm excited to be here. My name is Cassie Young. I'm a general partner at Primary Venture Partners. We're an early stage venture capital fund here in New York. But knowing the audience in front of me this morning, I'm compelled to share the following with you all. I consider myself to be an accidental venture capitalist. I spent 15 years in go-to-market leadership roles across marketing, sales, CS, prior to joining Primary about 5 years ago. Most recently, prior to joining Primary, I spent almost 7 years in the MarTech SaaS space at a company called Sailthrough, where I was ultimately the CRO and ran both new business and customer success. The reason I share this context with you all this morning is because through both my prior experience as an operator, as well as my more recent experiences as an investor and board member, I have spent far too many of my waking hours thinking through how software companies can drive revenue and margin from their installed base of customers. So when I got the invitation to opine on some of those learnings with you all today, I gladly accepted. And I'm really excited to leave you all with some fun, actionable takeaways that you'll be able to take back into your own businesses tomorrow. Now, the conference organizers gave us very clear directions. They said, leave the audience with 3 to 5 clear takeaways. But today is your lucky day because I'm going to give you 10 that you can bring back. And thank you. As an added bonus, while AI is invariably the talk of the town, we've already heard it brought up in many instances, and AI will undoubtedly be a force multiplier for helping us drive growth and profit, you're not going to need it today. Because the 10 hacks I'm going to walk you through are good old-fashioned elbow grease tactics that aren't going to require new technologies for you to go and implement. So we're going to get into it in a minute, but before we do that, I am going to issue one public service announcement. And this is a public service announcement that, regardless of the macro climate that we are sitting in, right? Whether we're in the boom, boom, go-go times of growth at all costs in 2021, whether we're dancing in the land of Rule of 40 optimization and accelerating our path to profitability, retention is always our cheapest form of growth. To bring this to life, let's consider the following. We can have a software business with 120% net dollar retention. That means that company could never sign another new customer again. I do not recommend you do that, but theoretically, you could never sign another new customer again and still grow 20% year over year. That's pretty incredible. And so if net dollar retention, if retention in general is our cheapest form of growth, the easiest hack that we have is keeping our existing customers. So the first hack I'm going to offer is a challenge to pop the question before the renewal. So what's the question? Well, the question is as follows. We know that your renewal is ideally a ways away, but if it were imminent, would your intention be to renew? If you have waited to the renewal to pop this question, you are too late. I like to regularly recite this line that sunlight is the best disinfectant, meaning we can't fix it or clean it if we don't know about it. This is a question that you want to be asking in every meaningful business review with key stakeholders, because if you know they're at risk, you have time to solve it. People will say, well, 9 months out, is that way too far out? Absolutely not, right? That's amazing. I have a friend, Latny Conant, over at 6 Sense, who has been very public on LinkedIn about this Just Ask program that they have at 6 Sense, right? She said, you want to know the #1 predictor of churn? The customer tells you they're going to churn. And so they've actually done a lot internally to bring a Slack channel to life where they celebrate customers saying, no, they're not going to renew, right? Because they have an opportunity to go and fix it. We just don't like surprises. All right, so let's assume that we've retained our customer. Now we need to grow them, right? We want to extract more out of their ACV, their annual average contract value. There are 2 ways, and I'm grossly simplifying, but bear with me, to grow ACVs, and we're going to talk a little bit about both of them. Lever #1 is organic expansion. To explain this very simply, this is just your customers use more of your product, Therefore, their contract with you grows. Lever number 2 is upsell, right? You are selling the customer more stuff. That may be that you have more products to sell them. That may be that you only have 2 out of 10 business units at NBC and you're trying to go for the rest of them, but you're selling them more stuff. We're going to hit on a few tactics that help with organic expansion, and then we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about some tactics that can help you with upsell. So tip number 1 on organic expansion is you need to make sure that your pricing model is actually configured in a way that allows for organic expansion. Emmanuel this morning talked about the importance of, I always call it, take your CFO to lunch day. I don't mean that literally, but find someone on the finance team as a buddy. I totally subscribe to that, particularly when it comes to pricing, to understand how you price, why you price, and when you do that, this is something you really want to dig into. Specifically, do you have an atomic unit of pricing, meaning that core unit of how you price the core product, that allows for organic expansion? So said another way, is your pricing set up such that you could do absolutely nothing? Again, I do not recommend that, but hypothetically, you could do absolutely nothing. And if your customer uses more of your product, their contract value will expand. So what you see here is some sample contract language where we're looking at a rate card for a software company whose atomic unit of pricing are MAUs, monthly active users. And what we see is that their license includes up to 350,000 MAUs, but the second they trip that hurdle, the contract size go up by $40,000, right? And that's ARR, that's locked in. That's not selling them a bill every month for overages, right? This is locked in ARR expansion that drives the ACV. So thinking about this, again, your team could do very little, and if the customer is using more, the contract grows. Now, if you have this type of atomic unit of pricing in place, you hopefully, you need to do this, you need to meter how the customer is pacing against that volume, because we've all been in the situation where the customer gets hit by the surprise contract uptick or the surprise bill. If you are doing that, I have another tactic for you. And this tactic is going to sound a little weird, but bear with me for a moment. Aspire to never, ever, ever have a renewal. So what in God's name am I talking about? If you have a customer who is pacing wildly ahead of the volume, so in that last example of the 350,000 MAUs, if we know that at the 6-month mark, they're already at 250 million MAUs or 250,000 MAUs, and there's not a ton of seasonality, et cetera, I would challenge you to go to that customer and say, Mr. Customer, here's the deal. You're pacing wildly ahead of the volume that you thought you were going to use. I'm going to do you one, and I'm going to rip up your contract. I'm going to rip up your contract, and I'm going to help you renegotiate it at your new estimated volume levels. Because if you had committed to that volume at the onset of the contract, you would have gotten a bigger deal, right? Bigger volume, right, means bigger rate card deal. If you do that, the only thing I am asking in return is that I'm going to tack 12 months onto the end of your contract. So that renewal that was supposed to be in 6 months is now going to be 18 months out. I call this the pull and the push. Pull forward the renewal, push out the contract end date. You can theoretically do this forever, in perpetuity, if the customer is continuing to grow, hence the aspiration of actually never having a proper renewal, the date that the contract might indicate. Okay, with a couple comments on organic expansion behind us, I want to spend the next few tactics talking about cross-sell and upsell. This first one is a really straightforward one, and it's constantly amazing to me how few companies do it. So this is one that maybe you could even take back literally tomorrow. This idea is to map all of your customers on a 2x2 that looks like this one. The vertical axis of this chart is your Net Promoter Score or some version of customer satisfaction. The horizontal axis is the white space per customer. So what I mean by white space is how much room do we have to sell them more stuff? Again, are they only using 1 of 5 products? Do we only have 2 of the 10 BUs? You can rate them small, medium, high. How much white space do we have? Focus your efforts on the upper right quadrant of this matrix. Customers who give you 9 and 10 responses in the NPS are a very easy target for your cross-sell and upsell efforts, right? Call them up and try to sell them more stuff. That's not even low-hanging fruit. That's fruit on the floor, right, to go pick up of people who love you, who may want to buy more. Okay, we're now going to talk about compensation. I could spend 5 hours talking about compensation and how it helps with this, but I'm going to try to condense it into just a couple minutes. So I'll talk in a moment about how you can use incentives to drive cross-sell and upsell specifically, and I'll quote my late great friend Charlie Munger here, that if you show me the incentive, I will show you the outcome. But before I do that, I do want to just give everyone in this room a reminder that this applies to every metric in your business. If you want to know what's going to happen, read the compensation plans. So let's go through a broader CS example, and then we'll bring it to life with how we can work on some product upsell examples. In a more macro context, right, we've talked a lot about how amazing it is when businesses have 120% net retention rates. Well, I regret to inform you that I have seen many businesses that have 120% net retention rate, but they might only have an 80% gross retention rate, which isn't fantastic, right? And so gross, I mean everything that fell out, all of the churn, all of the contraction, but we haven't added back in all of the expansion and cross-sell. That's not good, right? You have 20% gross churn, but 9 times out of 10, when I see a business of that flavor, the compensation plans for the CSM team are on net dollar retention. Now, gross retention is part of net retention, but you miss the point when you think about it that way. It's that you want to call attention into the compensation plan of the metrics that matter most, of where you have the most acute opportunities in the business and drawing attention to that. I lived this in a past life where we shift plans, we struggled with gross churn, and we said, you know what, we're actually going to double dip. Your plan's going to be 70% net retention, but it's going to be 30% growth. So if we don't, improve that, and at one point it was the flip of that, you're really thinking about this as a standalone metric. So where do incentives come into play with upsell? Well, I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite tactics here, which is a good old-fashioned SPIF, Sales Performance Incentive Fund, and one that I call the Lotto, okay? So my last business sale through, we ultimately sold to a private equity roll-up, and roll-ups are riveting animals in and of themselves, but one of the things that you really need to prove there is that you can cross-sell products across these different entities in the roll-up. And so my team at Sailthrough was tasked with, in a pretty time-sensitive manner in front of a board meeting, to go and try to sell this other product called LiveClicker. Like, we really have to accelerate this momentum. And so we went to the CSM team with a 30-day SPIF. And what this looked like is we said, here's the deal. For every qualified opportunity that you create for LiveClicker, like their team's actually going to qualify it, you're going to get a bounty, right? That bounty for the qualified op was like $50 or $100. But you're also going to get a lotto ticket for every one of those qualified opportunities. And at the end of the 30-day sprint, we're going to raffle off an all-expense paid trip for two to somewhere awesome, right? So if you get 15 paid opportunities, that's 15 tickets in the lotto. Now, we also gave a bounty when they had a closed-won deal from that, but these economics more than paid for themselves to go and do it. And I constantly see organizations getting cheap around these types of incentives. They're not cheap when it comes to the new logo team, interestingly, but cheap when it comes to the customer success team. I'm a huge subscriber in occasionally double paying, right, to drive the outcomes, because the economics, more often than not, can absolutely sustain it. Now, since we all live in go-to-market land, we've all heard the adage, time kills all deals. So if we know time kills all deals, let's factor that into our contracts. This happens all of the time in new logo land from the perspective of this proposal is only good until X date. But what you see less often is actually working that language into trying to drive product upsells. So let me show you some example language to consider that might help with this. Let's consider a world where we just signed a new logo, but at the very, very last minute, the new customer said, oh, that upsell product X that we talked about, drop that out of the contract. I don't want that anymore, right? That probably doesn't sound foreign to anyone in this room. Well, we know the longer we wait to re-engage them on that upsell product, the harder our job's going to become. So consider contract language like this, where we're effectively saying, okay, that's fine, you can drop it. Here's the deal. If you change your mind in the next 90 days, that product is still going to cost $100,000, what we quoted you before. But if you wait longer than 90 days, the price goes up by 50%. This just gives you something to come back to on the regular. And I chose 90 days very arbitrarily. Obviously, you would select what made sense with your business and time to value and all of those fun things. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about on cross-sell is the power of benchmarking. Okay? So this next slide is one that I used in every quarterly business review during my days at SailThrough. So our core product was an email product. And so one of the things that we would show our customers was basic email statistics and a benchmark of how they were doing vis-a-vis a set of very similar customers. Clients love this stuff because Tory Burch wants to know how Burberry's doing, right? You can't give the specifics, but they're all kind of secretly competitive with what they want to do. Now, yes, much of this was to drive value for the customers, but I must confess that we also had a very selfish agenda, which was to drive product upsell. So I'll point your attention here to the second from the bottom of the funnel, or the opt-out or unsubscribe rate. And what you see for this model customer is that they had an unsubscribe rate that was 75% worse than the benchmark. Well, not so coincidentally, we happen to have a product that was an opt-out prediction product that you could pay more for, that we could prove would reduce your unsubscribe rate, right? So we would say, look at the benchmarks. By the way, 75% is like really bad compared to the benchmark. We might be able to help. Now, many of you may be sitting in this room saying, well, I don't have access to benchmarks. I'll make two quick comments on that. One, try to change that, right? I think benchmarks are so powerful for really driving strategic conversation with your customers. Second, if you can't affect that change today, that's okay, because you don't need cold, hard data to benchmark. There's some qualitative hacks you can use. We've probably all seen things like the product adoption matrix, right, where we show all the stuff you could be using and what best-in-class customers might be using versus what you're doing, right? This is a very simple way to demonstrate that. A more powerful way to demonstrate that is a maturity curve, because no customer likes hearing that they're immature in terms of their sophistication of what's going on. So again, not so coincidentally, as we move a customer up and to the right of a maturity curve, there may or may not be some more products that are involved in helping them achieve that degree of sophistication. So we've talked a bit about growing contract values. Now let's talk about margin, because margin always matters. And it kind of cracks me up when I read the news these days, when everyone's like, oh, it's margin matters more, profit matters more. I'm like, it always mattered, right? I don't know why this suddenly moved to the back burner. So it always matters, and let's talk through a few techniques for how you help influence this in your roles in the CS organization. So the first thing we're going to talk about is ensuring that every one of your employees is focused on the highest value work for that role. So let's look at an example. We're looking at an example of where CSMs spend their time. So this organization is tracking CSM time. Everyone should be doing that, even if the CSMs hate it, right? What we learned from this chart is that 35% of the hours by the CSM team are spent on ticket support. They're jumping in the support tickets. They're prodding the support agent to respond to their customers. We've probably all been there before. Who knows why that happened? Maybe we massively expanded our CSM team, but didn't grow the support team, as quickly. Regardless, this is a financial crime to your organization. So that may sound hyperbolic, but it's not. Because the typical CSM probably costs at least 25% or more than a support agent, right? So you have them focused on the right work. You need to the wrong work. You need to reallocate that work to the cheaper resource when you go and do that. Another example from this chart, and it's a little bit grayed out here, is we see 10% of the time is being spent on ops and administrative stuff. Now, there's a question of if we took some of that burden off the CSM on the team, could they actually manage more? And so I'll tell you a story. In my sail-through days, I had a really strong VP of CS who reported to me, and she begged me for a CS ops person for forever. And I kept rebuffing her, right? And she finally came back to me and said, here's the deal. If you give me a CS ops hire, I guarantee you I will increase ARR managed per CSM by 15% within 9 months. And I said, challenge accepted, right? And so I was chuckling this morning when I saw the data around the reduction in CS ops. That's a really good way to advocate, right, for a CS ops headcount if you need it. She succeeded on that. She took that work off their plate, and it opened up more space to manage more ARR. Okay, next tactic is to devise a plan for unprofitable customers. We've all been in the room of, we've got these ankle biters, our lowest paying customers take up the most time. You need to prove it with data. So here's a sample chart I've used in past lives and I use with portfolio companies to help demonstrate this. The way to read this is that each column is a set of customers based on their ACV band. So the first column is the set of customers who pay you $500,000 a year or more. Reading top to bottom down the rows, the first row is what percent of our company's total ARR does this segment comprise? So this group of customers that pay $500,000 or more make up 29% of our ARR. And because we are tracking CSM hours and time spent, I know that they comprise 16% of the CSM's team total time, and I know that they have an NPS of about 65. If I go all the way to the right and look at the segment of customers that are paying us less than $100,000 a year, I see a really, really different story. They make up 19% of our ARR, but take up 35% of the team's time. And by the way, their NPS is pretty crappy. It's 5. I would argue this is not a great customer segment for us. But it begs the question of what do we do about it? Well, earlier this morning, Emmanuel laid reference to the idea of monetizing your CS teams in certain ways. So I'm going to walk you through an example of something I lived during my days at Sailthrough. It was a chart that looked really similar to this one. We were just wildly unsuccessful with customers who paid us less than $75,000 a year because, quite frankly, the product was really hard to use. And we think that was kind of a proxy for resourcing. And so what we said was, we need to fire those customers, or if not, they have to pay their way. And so the technique that we took here was to say, we're going to go to these customers with board approval, of course, important nuance, and we're going to give them a couple of options. One, they can pay us to access a CSM. They can pay like $12,000, $15,000 a year to help offset this, really wonky math here. Two, they lose access to the CSM if they don't do that, and they can just reach out to technical support, but that's not like really a great outcome for these larger customers. Or three, we tell them, you don't have to wait for your renewal. If none of that works, you can just stay on until you find a new provider, and we wish you well. We did this in tranches to make sure that I didn't have to go to a board meeting and explain why I lost several millions of dollars of ARR in 90 days. And it worked way better than I ever could have expected. The silver lining was that many customers were willing to pay for access to that CSM. And we structured it as a line item in the contract, so we were able to keep that as ARR. Okay, they say to save the best for last, so I have saved my best and favorite tactic for last, and it's the only thing that has a little bit of math in it, so just hold on to your hats for 1 second. So my favorite tactic for how CS can help influence margin or anything that we talk about today is using support data to influence the product roadmap. So often you hear CS teams talk about ticket deflection. And when they do that, they say, we launched a knowledge base or we have how-to videos. That's all well and good, but the holy grail of ticket deflection is just getting it out of there altogether. And the way to do that is to understand where are customers getting stuck and how costly is that to your organization. So consider this chart that is looking at ticket, topic, type, how's that for alliteration, and the number of touches that are required to resolve a ticket of this variety. So if we look at the GDPR line, we see that a ticket about GDPR requires 5.7 back and forth in order to reach a resolution for the customer. Now, what you may or may not be able to read in the footnote is that we have also calculated an average cost per touch of $36.81. So how do we calculate that? We looked at, for the whole year, what is the fully loaded cost of my support team, and I'm going to divide that by the total number of touches across all of the tickets that I worked in the entirety of a year to figure out the cost per touch. So if I have the cost per touch and I know the number of touches per ticket, I now can calculate a cost per ticket. So if we stick with that GDPR example, 5.7 touches, $36.81 a touch, we've multiplied those numbers together to say each GDPR ticket costs us $210 to resolve. What I can now do is go and marry that cost with my ticket volume. And I see that in the last 12 months, LTM, I had 1,592 GDPR tickets. At $210 a ticket, that cost the organization $334,000. Why'd that happen? Well, it's GDPR. Maybe there was all this back and forth about manual requests for data deletion, and if you gave them a button or a simple flow to do that, you take some of that out. You might not take all 334,000 of it out, but you get the point of it, right? You extract major costs out of the support organization. So food for thought, really liaise with the product team to understand what's going on here. So that's going to be a wrap on our 10 tactics for today. I really hope with the balance of the year, tough to believe we've only got about 90 days left, they're helpful to you all. But I'll give you one final reminder before I wrap today, which is as you implement these tactics, make sure you're taking credit for your work. So I sit in a lot of boardrooms. The sales leaders love to take credit for their work. The CS leaders, less so. So I'm going to give you two of my favorite slides for CS teams that I think can be really powerful for taking credit. So the slide on the left shows two things: your average contract value per customer and the number of products per customer and how that's progressing over time. This is a very, very simple visual for taking credit for selling the customers more stuff and growing the contract values with them. The chart on the right is looking at the margin walk, as I'll call it. What this is doing, because I know it's kind of small up here, is it's showing you what was your starting gross margin, where's your ending gross margin, whether that actually happened or it's your projection for 2025, and all of those little green bars are the tactics you're going to deploy to help you get there. So one of them may be that you've offshored a portion of support to somewhere in Eastern Europe to help bring the cost basis down. Another one might be that reallocation of resources that we uncovered in our pie chart, right, of taking work that should be done by support and moving it from CSM to support. But you're taking credit for your work. That's it from me today. I hope this is helpful to you all. Good luck with a great Q4, and thanks so much for joining.